Good morning and welcome to The Art of Composition. Thanks for joining me today. I appreciate it. I thought I would look at another Thomas Kegler painting today, but while I'm doing that, I want to talk a little bit about the painter's secret geometry. And the reason I want to talk about that a little bit more today in detail is because I added a few books to my recommendations page on my homepage on my website. And the first book was by Greg Kreutz and the other one was by Suzanne Brooker. And as I was reading them, they're fantastic books, by the way. Highly recommend them. But I noticed that most artists today, even though they're classically trained, they won't talk about the harmonic armature. There's very few that do. And if you have downloaded my user's guide, you'll notice that I talk a lot about Juliet Aristides and Thomas Kegler. And the reason I talk about them a lot and I demo their work a lot is because they are open about what they're doing, and it helps me to teach this information because I know they're using it, even though I know that all the other classically trained artists are using it as well. But it gives what I'm doing a little bit more credibility when it comes to selling this ideology to artists that aren't familiar with it. But there's this ideology known as the painter's secret geometry, and what this is that the artist doesn't speak openly about their design. That is changing because of the internet, because of artists like Aristides and Kegler and a few others. But for the majority of the artists out there that are writing these books and so on, they don't talk about the harmonic armature. They talk about composition in very vague terms, but they don't talk about how they're organizing their objects on the canvas. And that is composition. That's design. And without design, you can't have art. So if you come across artists that are successful at what they're doing, for example, like Anna Rose Bain, Thomas Kegler, Aristides, Greg Kreutz, Suzanne Brooker, they're all using this harmonic armature. And even though they don't use it in the same way, they're still using it. And that is one reason why their work stands above others that don't understand design. An artist that doesn't understand design cannot compete with an artist that understands classical design. They just can't compete with them. There's no way. So let me analyze this painting and I'll talk a little bit more about that today. Before I drop the harmonic armature, I want to point out a few things though. You have a dominant vertical here, and let me just change this. You have a strong dominant vertical here. You have diagonal lines being played out here as well though. You have one here, you have one here. Then you have another shorter vertical here, but then you have another vertical here as well. So you have these dominant lines being played out in this. It's a rather simple idea, but the composition, Thomas Kegler didn't just go to the canvas and randomly put these things there. You also have another diagonal line right here too as well. If you squint, you can see it. At first, when I saw this, I didn't pick up on it, but it's there, and it's also being repeated right here in a shorter diagonal. But these are your dominant lines with this composition. Thomas Kegler is not placing these dominant lines randomly at all. You have a horizontal line right here as well. Let me just point that out right here. So with these few lines, these lines are being derived from the armature. He's not going to the canvas and saying, I'll just put it wherever it feels right. It does not work. Your feelings don't matter when it comes to design. You know, I know that sounds a little bit crude, but it's the truth. You have to place your elements inside a grid, and it has to work within that design grid. Now, you can use the harmonic armature a million different ways. There's an infinite amount of variety you can design with one grid. So there's a lot of flexibility, but you're not placing this stuff randomly, and let me show you what I mean by that. As I start dropping the armature, you will see some of these diagonal lines come to play out that I was mentioning just a few seconds ago. And like I said, when I was reading these books over this weekend, it really hit me. I'm like, these artists, they're talking a lot about composition. They throw the word design around a lot, and it does have a lot of different meanings and a lot of different applications, but you can't ignore the armature when it comes to learning this information. And like I said, it might be, there's a few reasons for it. It might be because a lot of artists are intimidated by it, so they don't want to scare their audience away. But at the same time, there's also, I think, a competitive aspect to it as well, because like I said, the artist that understands design and uses it in their work compared to the artist that is designing based on their feelings with no knowledge on design, there's no way that artist could compete with a classically trained artist, even if everything else was equal. In other words, they had the same talent for drawing, color theory, and so on, technique. If they didn't understand design, they wouldn't be able to compete with the artist that does. There's just no way they could. There's a lot of examples of artwork designed using your feelings, and it just does not work. It can't compare to a structured design, because at the heart of all art is great design. And that's something Kenyon Cox talks about a lot in his book, The Classic Point of View. Check out the chapter on design. I believe it's chapter 3. But even dropping a few lines here, you can see this diagonal line is already picking up this diagonal here. You have this diagonal line here picking up this angle right here in the leaves there, and then this one here. So without even creating any additional divisions, you can already see things starting to come together. And like I said, Thomas Kegler, he's not looking at his canvas and going, oh, it feels right here. And this diagonal line that I was talking about in the shadow, that's being picked up with this line from the armature. Things lock into place in a good design. And the reason it's so important is because it's telling the eye, it's giving the eye visual order. And without that order, the brain doesn't know how to interpret the information. That's why when you look at artwork by artists that don't understand design, their compositions are chaotic. They're all over the place. They don't make any sense. All right, so I have the harmonic armature drawn out. Let me just point out a few things here. I can drop a horizontal line right here where this series of diagonal lines intersect. It gives me this horizontal line here. But when I do that, I can then drop another vertical. And that vertical is right here, where you have the string holding up the carrots. That's being derived from that diagonal line and that horizontal line right there. So that's how you're getting that vertical there. Since I dropped this horizontal line, I can then, from this corner, the top of the armature, to this line that I just dropped, now it encloses this angle right here. And from that point, I can drop a horizontal line here, which locks that area in place. Actually, no, that's not what I want. But I do want this diagonal line here. Actually, I take that back. I do want that line. It's right here. So you're locking the top area in there. Right there. All right, so with just a few lines dropped, I now have my dominant vertical, but I also can drop a vertical right here as well with this series of diagonal lines right there. Just bring this in a little bit closer. There you go. And then you have another one right here. Which is giving me this vertical right here with a strong contrast right in that area. So with just a few lines, you can see what Thomas Kegler is doing. And let me just highlight these in blue and thicken up the line. So you have this one, then you have this top one here, right? You have this vertical running along here. Then you have this dominant vertical right here. You have another vertical at that point. You have this horizontal line right here. But you also have this diagonal line running right here. And notice how it's following the angles. In the leaves of the carrots. And another one right here. So you have all of these lines following the angles in the composition. Then you have another one coming down here. You have this diagonal line, as I mentioned, in the shadow on the wall right here. You have this diagonal line following this caret right here. And in the painting, you can see there's a strong shadow there. It's following this diagonal line. So even with a simple subject like this, you still have divisions being placed that not only lock the subject into place, but are following the diagonal lines of your subject. And when I outline them in blue, it becomes a little bit more obvious. And this is just the dominant lines. There are more, but to keep this simple, it gives you an idea that, again, a simple subject, a bunch of carets against a background, and some leaves that are branching off of the carets. You can't get any simpler than that. But again, Thomas Kegler, he's not placing it randomly on the canvas. It makes sense where he's placing it visually. That's going to be it for today. I hope this helps a little bit. And you have to understand that just because you're not reading about this information in a book, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate it, as always.